to After Dark Chronicles, where the real stories come out. When the sun goes down, the truth comes up. Tonight's story. A man spent 25 years building a company from nothing. He trained the CEO. He created every system. He was months away from retirement. And then, at 59 years old, they fired him, replaced him with someone half his age for half the salary. They thought he'd just go away quietly. They were wrong. What he did next didn't just get revenge. It destroyed an entire company, cost his former boss everything he owned, and sent shockwaves through an entire industry. This is his story. This story comes from Reddit, posted by a 59-year-old man who learned that loyalty means nothing when profit is on the line, and that underestimating someone is the fastest way to your own destruction. Here's what he wrote. My name is Thomas. I'm 59 years old. I've worked in manufacturing and supply chain logistics my entire adult life, 40 years in the industry. The last 25 of those years were spent at a company called Meridian Supply Solutions. When I started at Meridian, it was a tiny operation, 15 employees, 2 million in annual revenue, barely surviving. The owner, Richard Chen, had inherited the company from his father, but had no idea how to run it. He was 28 years old, fresh out of business school, full of ideas but zero practical experience. Richard hired me as operations manager. My job was to fix the disaster he'd created. Inventory was a mess. Clients were furious. Employees were quitting. The company was bleeding money. I rolled up my sleeves and got to work. I restructured the entire supply chain. I renegotiated contracts with suppliers and saved us 30% on costs. I implemented new inventory management systems. I trained the staff. I personally went to every major client and rebuilt those relationships. Within 2 years, Meridian went from barely surviving to thriving. Revenue tripled. We expanded to 50 employees. Richard was thrilled. He gave me a raise, a bonus, and told me I was the best hire he'd ever made. Over the next 23 years, I continued building that company. I brought in major contracts with Fortune 500 clients. I opened 3 new warehouses. I grew the team to over 200 employees. I trained dozens of people who went on to leadership roles. Meridian went from 2 million in revenue to over 80 million annually. Richard became wealthy. Very wealthy. He bought a mansion, started collecting luxury cars, took month-long vacations to Europe and Asia. Meanwhile, I worked 60-hour weeks, sometimes 70. I missed my kids' soccer games. I missed anniversaries. I sacrificed my personal life to build his company. But I didn't mind. I loved the work. I was good at it. And Richard always treated me well. Good salary, generous bonuses, respect. He'd tell people Thomas built this company. I just signed the checks. I believed we had a partnership. I believed loyalty mattered. I was an idiot. Last year I turned 59. I'd been planning to retire at 65, maybe 62 if I wanted to take it easy. I had a good retirement fund. My wife and I had plans to travel, spend time with our grandkids, enjoy life. Then, in January of this year, Richard called me into his office. He had someone with him, a young guy, maybe 30 years old, sharp suit, overconfident smile. Richard introduced him as Kyle Morrison, said Kyle was joining the company as a consultant to help optimize operations and explore growth opportunities. I shook Kyle's hand. Seemed like a normal hire. Consultants came and went, no big deal. But over the next few weeks I started noticing things. Kyle was in every meeting I had, taking notes, asking detailed questions about my processes, my vendor relationships, my client contacts. Richard would say, Kyle's just learning the business, help him out. So I did. I taught Kyle everything, every system I'd built, every relationship I'd cultivated, every trick I'd learned in 40 years. I handed him my entire playbook, and he took notes on every single word. 2 months later, Richard called me into his office again. This time, Kyle wasn't there. Richard looked uncomfortable. He said, Thomas, we need to talk about your future here. I said, okay, what's up? He said, you've done incredible work for this company. You've been invaluable, but the business is changing. We need to bring in fresh perspectives, younger energy, people who understand modern technology and can take us into the next phase of growth. I felt my stomach drop. I said, what are you saying? He said, we're restructuring. Your position is being eliminated. We're offering you a severance package, 6 months' salary. It's very generous. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I said, Richard, I've been here 25 years. I built this company with you. You're firing me. He said it's not personal. It's business. The board thinks it's time for new leadership in operations. I said, what board? You own this company outright. He looked away. He said, I brought in some investors last year. They have a say now. This decision came from them. I said, so you're replacing me with Kyle? He didn't answer directly. He said, Kyle brings a fresh approach. He's hungry. He's cost-effective. Cost-effective. That's when I understood. Kyle was making half what I made, probably less. They were getting rid of me because I was expensive. I said, this is age discrimination. I could sue you. Richard's face hardened. He said you could, but you won't. Because if you do, I'll make sure you never work in this industry again. I know everyone. I'll bury you. Take the severance and go quietly. Thomas, don't make this ugly. I was shaking with rage. 25 years of loyalty. And this is how it ended. I said I want it in writing. The severance offer, everything. He said, of course. HR will have the paperwork ready tomorrow. I walked out of his office. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. I went home. My wife took one look at me and knew something was wrong. I told her everything. She was furious. She said, sue him. This is illegal. I said, he said he'd destroy me if I tried. She said, so what? You're just gonna let him get away with this? I thought about it for days. Part of me wanted to take the severance and walk away. I was 59. I didn't need the stress of a legal battle. But the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. I'd given that company everything. I'd made Richard rich, and he threw me away like garbage the second it was convenient. So I made a decision. I wasn't gonna sue. Lawsuits take years, cost a fortune. And even if I won, what would I get? Some money. My job back working for someone who clearly didn't value me. No, I was gonna do something better. I was gonna destroy him, but I needed to be smart. I signed the severance agreement, took the 6-month salary, smiled, thanked Richard for the opportunity, played the part of the gracious old employee riding off into the sunset, and then I got to work. See, here's what Richard and Kyle didn't understand. I didn't just work at Meridian for 25 years. I built it. Every major client relationship, I cultivated that. Every vendor contract, I negotiated that. Every operational system, I designed that. I had relationships with every single person who mattered in that company's ecosystem. And none of those relationships were with Richard or Kyle. They were with me. I started making phone calls. First, I called our 3 biggest clients, companies that represented about 40% of Meridian's revenue. I'd worked with these people for decades. We weren't just business associates, we were friends. I'd been to their kids' weddings. We golfed together. We trusted each other. I told them I'd retired from Meridian, asked how they were doing. Casual conversation. Then I mentioned, very casually, that I was thinking about doing some consulting work, maybe helping companies optimize their supply chains. All 3 of them said the same thing. If you're consulting, we want to work with you. Within 2 weeks, I had consulting contracts with all 3 of them. The terms were simple. I'd help them find better vendors, better pricing, more efficient logistics. In exchange, they'd pay me a retainer. But here's the thing. All 3 of these companies were currently working with Meridian, and their contracts with Meridian were up for renewal in the next 6 months. I told them, you know, I've been in this industry a long time. I have relationships with suppliers that can beat Meridian's pricing by 20%, and I can get you better service. They were interested. Very interested. Over the next 3 months, I systematically moved all 3 of those major clients away from Meridian. I connected them with competing suppliers. I helped them negotiate better deals. I made sure they were taken care of, and one by one they decided not to renew their contracts with Meridian. That was 40% of Meridian's revenue. Gone. But I didn't stop there. I called our mid-tier clients, 8 companies that each represented about 3 to 5% of revenue. I did the same thing. Casual conversations, consulting offers, better pricing, better service. 6 of them moved their business away from Meridian within 4 months. Now you might be thinking, isn't this illegal? Non-compete agreements. Here's the beautiful part. I'd negotiated my employment contract 25 years ago, back when Meridian was tiny and Richard was desperate. There was no non-compete clause. I could do whatever I wanted. Richard had never bothered to update my contract because he trusted me. Big mistake. But I still wasn't done. Remember those vendor relationships I'd built? The suppliers Meridian depended on for inventory. I'd negotiated those contracts. I had personal relationships with the owners and executives at every major supplier. I called them too. I said, hey, I'm doing consulting now. I'm working with several companies in the industry. I'm looking for reliable suppliers who can offer competitive pricing and excellent service. You interested? They all were. And then I said, very carefully, by the way, I heard Meridian is having some cash flow issues. You might want to tighten up their payment terms. Make sure you're getting paid on time. This was true, by the way. With all that lost revenue, Meridian was absolutely having cash flow problems. I wasn't lying. I was just making sure the suppliers knew about it. Within weeks, Meridian's suppliers started demanding faster payment. Net 30 instead of net 60. Some even demanded payment on delivery. This put enormous pressure on Meridian's finances. They were already losing revenue. Now they had to pay their suppliers faster. Cash flow became a nightmare. I heard through the grapevine that Richard had to take out a business loan just to make payroll. But I still wasn't done. I called the best employees at Meridian, the people I'd trained, the ones who were talented and ambitious. I said, I'm starting a consulting firm. I'm looking for people who want to work on interesting projects with great clients. You interested? 3 of Meridian's top managers quit within 2 months to join me. This wasn't revenge. This was dismantling. Piece by piece, client by client, employee by employee, vendor by vendor. I was taking apart everything I'd built, and there was nothing Richard could do about it, because none of it was illegal. I wasn't sabotaging. I wasn't stealing. I was just doing business. Better business than Meridian could do without me. 6 months after I was fired, Meridian's revenue had dropped by 60%. They'd lost most of their major clients, their best employees. Their vendor relationships were strained. Richard was panicking. I heard he tried to win back some of the clients. He called them personally, offered discounts, promised better service. But it was too late. Those clients were happy with their new arrangements I'd helped set up. They had no reason to go back to Meridian. Then Richard made a desperate move. He tried to hire me back. His assistant called me, said Richard wanted to meet for coffee, wanted to discuss opportunities. I agreed to meet. Why not? I wanted to see him squirm. We met at a Starbucks. Richard looked terrible. He'd lost weight. His suit didn't fit right. He had bags under his eyes. He looked like a man who wasn't sleeping. He said, Thomas, I made a mistake. Letting you go was the worst decision I've ever made. The company is struggling without you. I want you to come back. Name your price. I sipped my coffee. I said, you fired me 6 months ago because I was too expensive and too old. What changed? He said, I was wrong. I listened to bad advice. The investors pushed me to cut costs. I should have fought for you. I'm sorry. I said, you told me if I sued you, you'd bury me. You threatened to destroy my reputation. Remember that? He looked down. I was angry. I didn't mean it. I leaned forward. I said, Richard, I spent 25 years building your company. I made you rich. I sacrificed my time, my health, my family, and you threw me away the second it was convenient. You didn't just fire me. You disrespected me. You treated me like I was disposable. So no, I'm not coming back. Not for any price. He said, then what do you want? You're taking my clients. You're poaching my employees. You're destroying my company. What do you want from me? I smiled. I said, I want you to understand what it feels like to lose everything you built. I want you to know that loyalty matters, and I want you to remember that you did this to yourself. He stared at me. This is revenge. I said, no, this is business. You taught me that, remember? It's not personal, it's business. I stood up. I walked out. I never spoke to Richard again. 3 months later, Meridian Supply Solutions filed for bankruptcy. They couldn't recover from the revenue loss. The investors pulled out. Richard had to sell his mansion to cover debts. His wife divorced him, took half of what was left. He lost everything. Kyle, the golden boy consultant who was supposed to be the future. He got fired 2 months before the bankruptcy. Turns out, he didn't actually know how to run a supply chain company. Shocking. Last I heard, Richard was working as a mid-level manager at a logistics firm in another state, making a fraction of what he used to make. Living in a small apartment, probably wondering how it all went so wrong. Meanwhile, my consulting firm is thriving. I work with great clients. I have a small team of talented people I trust. I make more money now than I ever did at Meridian. and I work half the hours. My wife and I just got back from a month in Italy. We're planning a trip to Japan next year. I see my grandkids every week. I sleep well at night. People ask me if I feel bad about what happened to Richard, if I regret destroying his company. I don't, not even a little. He made a choice. He chose short-term profit over long-term loyalty. He chose to throw away 25 years of partnership because he thought he could replace experience with youth and save money. He was wrong, and he paid the price. Some people say what I did was ruthless. Maybe it was, but here's the thing. I didn't break any laws. I didn't steal anything. I didn't sabotage anything. I just took my skills, my relationships and my knowledge, and I used them to build something better. If that destroyed Meridian in the process, well, that's on Richard. He built his empire on my back, and when he kicked me off, the whole thing collapsed. That's not revenge. That's just gravity. The most satisfying moment. About a year after Meridian went bankrupt, I ran into Richard at an industry conference. He saw me from across the room. I could see him debating whether to approach me. He didn't. He turned and walked the other way. Good. He should be ashamed. Because at the end of the day, this story isn't about me destroying Richard's company. It's about Richard destroying his own company. The moment he decided I was disposable, I just made sure he understood the consequences of that decision. And let me tell you something. Every single person who worked with me, who trusted me, who left Meridian to join me, they're all doing great, better than they ever were, because I take care of the people who are loyal to me. I learned that lesson from Richard. I learned what not to do. So if you're reading this and you're thinking about screwing over someone who's been loyal to you, who's built something for you, who's given you years of their life, think very carefully, because they might just be the only thing holding your empire together. And when they're gone, you might find out that you never really knew how to build anything at all. You just knew how to take credit for someone else's work. Richard learned that lesson the hard way, and I have zero sympathy for him. But the story doesn't end there, because about 18 months after Meridian went bankrupt, I got a phone call that changed everything again. It was from a lawyer named Patricia Vance. She said she represented a group of former Meridian employees who had lost their jobs when the company collapsed. She said they were considering a class action lawsuit against Richard for mismanagement, and wanted to know if I'd be willing to testify. I said, testify about what? She said, about the events leading up to your termination and the subsequent collapse of the company. We believe Richard engaged in fraudulent business practices and that his decisions directly led to the company's bankruptcy. I was intrigued. I asked what kind of fraudulent practices they were talking about. Patricia explained that during the discovery process for the bankruptcy, some interesting documents had surfaced. Turns out, Richard had been cooking the books. Not in a massive Enron-level way, but enough to inflate the company's value when he brought in those investors I mentioned. He'd been reporting revenue that didn't exist yet, claiming contracts that were pending as confirmed deals, basically lying to investors to get their money. When I left and those pending contracts never materialized because they were built on relationships with me, not with Meridian, the whole house of cards fell apart. Patricia said the investors are suing Richard for fraud. The employees are suing for wrongful termination and unpaid wages. We think you have information that could strengthen both cases. I thought about it. Part of me wanted to stay out of it. I'd already won. I'd destroyed Richard's company. I was living my best life. Why get dragged into a legal mess? But then Patricia said something that stuck with me. She said 23 people lost their jobs when Meridian collapsed. Some of them had been there for years. They lost retirement contributions, health insurance. Some of them are still looking for work. Richard walked away from this relatively unscathed compared to them. He deserves to be held accountable. She was right. The people who suffered most from Meridian's collapse weren't Richard. He lost his mansion and his marriage, sure, but he still had his education, his connections, his ability to get another job. The warehouse workers, the admin staff, the mid-level managers who didn't have the relationships or skills to land consulting gigs like I did, they were the ones who really got screwed. So I agreed to testify. The deposition was scheduled for 3 months later. In the meantime, Patricia asked me to go through my old files and see if I had any documents that might be relevant. Emails, memos, anything that showed Richard's decision-making process or revealed information about the company's finances. I still had everything. I'm a meticulous record keeper, always have been. Every email I'd ever sent or received at Meridian was backed up on an external hard drive. Every memo, every financial report. I spent 2 weeks going through it all, and what I found was damning. Emails from Richard to the investors claiming we had 15 million in confirmed contracts for the following year. We didn't. We had maybe 8 million confirmed. The rest were prospects, leads. Nothing solid, but Richard presented them as done deals. I found emails where Richard instructed the finance team to classify certain expenses as investments instead of operating costs to make the profit margins look better. I found memos where Richard discussed cutting my salary and replacing me with Kyle specifically to improve the bottom line for the investors. He wrote, and I quote, "Thomas is expensive and set in his ways. Kyle brings fresh energy and costs 60% less. This move alone will add $500,000 to our annual profit." He'd been planning to fire me for at least 6 months before he actually did it. He'd lied to me, looked me in the eye and told me I was invaluable while simultaneously planning my exit. I handed everything over to Patricia. She was thrilled. She said, "This is exactly what we needed. Richard is going to have a very bad day in court." The deposition was brutal for Richard. I sat across the table from him in a conference room. He looked even worse than the last time I'd seen him. Thinner, grayer, defeated. His lawyer was there. Patricia was there, a court reporter, video camera recording everything. Patricia asked me to walk through my employment history at Meridian. I did. 25 years. Every major accomplishment, every client I brought in, every system I built. Then she asked me about my termination. I explained exactly what Richard had said, how he'd claimed it was a board decision, even though there was no board, how he'd threatened to destroy my reputation if I sued. Patricia asked, "Did Richard ever discuss the company's financial situation with you before your termination?" I said yes. About a year before I was fired, he told me the company was doing great, best year ever. He said we were on track to break 90 million in revenue. Patricia pulled up a document, an email from Richard to the investors from around the same time. In it, Richard wrote that the company was struggling with cash flow and needed additional investment to stay afloat. Patricia asked, "So Richard told you the company was thriving while telling investors it was struggling?" I said, "Apparently, yes." Richard's lawyer objected, said I was speculating. Patricia rephrased, "Based on this email, does it appear that Richard gave you and the investors different information about the company's financial health?" I said, "Yes, it does." Patricia went through email after email, each one showing a pattern of deception. Richard lying to investors, Richard lying to employees, Richard manipulating numbers to make himself look good. By the end of the deposition, Richard looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. His lawyer kept trying to object, to redirect, to minimize the damage, but the evidence was overwhelming. 3 months later, the case went to trial. I testified again, this time in front of a judge. The investors' lawsuit and the employees' lawsuit had been combined into one case. Richard was being sued for fraud, mismanagement, and wrongful termination. The lawyers on the other side tore him apart. They showed email after email of Richard lying. They showed financial documents proving he'd inflated revenue projections. They brought in former employees who testified that Richard had promised them bonuses and retirement contributions that never materialized. They brought in the investors who testified that Richard had lied about the company's contracts and financial health. And then they brought me in. I testified for 6 hours. I walked the jury through everything. How I built the company, how Richard took credit, how he fired me to save money, how the company collapsed because it was built on my relationships, not his. How Richard had systematically lied to everyone around him to maintain an illusion of success. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they came back, they ruled in favor of the plaintiffs. Richard was found liable for fraud and mismanagement. The financial judgment was staggering. $3.2 million, split between the investors and the former employees. Richard didn't have $3.2 million. He'd already lost most of his wealth in the divorce and the bankruptcy. So the court seized what was left. His retirement accounts, his car, everything. Richard was financially destroyed, completely and utterly ruined. But the court also did something else. They referred the case to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges. Fraud, embezzlement, wire fraud for lying to investors electronically. 6 months after the civil trial, Richard was indicted on 4 criminal counts. I wasn't involved in the criminal case. I'd already testified twice. I'd done my part, but I followed the news coverage. Richard pled guilty to 2 counts of wire fraud in exchange for the other charges being dropped. He was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison. 18 months for destroying a company, lying to investors, screwing over employees and ruining lives. It didn't seem like enough, but it was something. I got a call from Patricia after the sentencing. She said, "I wanted to thank you. Without your testimony and your documents, we never would have been able to prove fraud. You gave those employees justice." I said, "I'm glad I could help." She said, "You know, Richard's lawyer tried to paint you as a disgruntled employee who sabotaged the company out of spite." I laughed. What did the jury think of that? She said they didn't buy it. The evidence was too clear. Richard destroyed his own company by lying and mismanaging. You just made sure people knew the truth. After I hung up, I sat on my porch with a glass of whiskey and thought about everything that had happened. 3 years ago, I was a loyal employee who thought hard work and dedication would be rewarded. I thought loyalty mattered. I was naive. Richard taught me that in the business world, loyalty is a one-way street. Employers expect it from employees, but they don't return it. The second you become inconvenient or expensive, you're gone. So I learned to play by those rules. I took everything I'd built, all my skills, all my relationships, and I used them for myself instead of for someone who didn't appreciate them. And in doing so, I didn't just get revenge. I got justice. For me. For the employees who lost their jobs. For everyone Richard screwed over in his pursuit of profit. Some people still think what I did was wrong, that I should have just taken the severance and moved on. That destroying Meridian was cruel. But here's what those people don't understand. I didn't destroy Meridian. Richard did. The moment he decided to fire me, he destroyed the foundation the company was built on. I just made sure he couldn't rebuild. And I don't feel bad about that. Not even a little. Because Richard had a choice. He could have valued loyalty. He could have treated me with respect. He could have let me retire with dignity after 25 years of service. Instead, he chose greed. He chose to throw me away. And he paid the price. There's a lesson here for anyone in business. If you build your success on someone else's back, you better make damn sure you keep them happy. Because the moment they leave, voluntarily or otherwise, you might find out that you never had any real value to begin with. You were just riding their coattails. Richard rode mine for 25 years. And when he kicked me off, he fell hard. As for me, I'm doing better than ever. My consulting firm just signed its biggest contract yet. I'm working with amazing clients. I have a great team. I'm making more money than I ever dreamed of. And I'm doing it all on my own terms. No boss. No one to answer to. No one who can fire me because I'm too old or too expensive. I control my own destiny now. And that feeling is worth more than any salary Richard ever paid me. I still run into people from the industry sometimes. They ask me what happened with Meridian. I give them the short version. I worked there for 25 years. They fired me. The company collapsed shortly after. I'm doing consulting now. Most people nod and move on. But every once in a while someone will say, "I heard you destroyed that company on purpose." And I'll smile and say, "I didn't destroy anything. I just took my skills somewhere they were appreciated." If the company couldn't survive without me, that says more about them than it does about me. And that's the truth. I didn't destroy Meridian. I just stopped building it. And without me, it turned out there was nothing left. Richard is out of prison now. I heard he's working at a small logistics firm making about $60,000 a year, barely scraping by. His ex-wife remarried. His kids don't talk to him. He's alone, broke, forgotten. And I'm sure he thinks about me sometimes. I'm sure he wonders what would have happened if he'd just let me retire with dignity, if he'd valued loyalty over short-term savings, if he'd treated me like a partner instead of a disposable asset. He'd probably still be rich, still have his company, still have his family. But he didn't. And now he has nothing. And me, I have everything. I have my health, my family, my business, my freedom, my dignity. I won. Not because I'm smarter or better, but because I understood something Richard never did. Your reputation is built on how you treat people, and the people you treat well will go to war for you. The people you treat like garbage will watch you burn. Richard treated me like garbage, so I watched him burn, and I'd do it again. 5 years have passed since I walked out of Richard's office for the last time. 5 years since I decided to stop being angry and start being strategic. 5 years since I dismantled everything I'd spent 25 years building. And in that time, I've learned more about business, about people, and about myself than I did in the previous 4 decades of my career. My consulting firm, which I named Apex Supply Solutions, now has 12 full-time employees and brings in over $5 million in annual revenue. We work with some of the biggest names in manufacturing and logistics, Our client retention rate is 98%. Why? Because I learned from Richard's mistakes. I treat my people well, I pay them fairly, I respect their expertise, I give them ownership over their work, and in return they're loyal. Not out of fear, but out of mutual respect. One of my employees is Sarah Chen, Richard's daughter. Yes, you read that right. About 2 years after Richard went to prison, his daughter reached out to me on LinkedIn. She said she'd just graduated with a degree in supply chain management and was looking for opportunities. She said she knew what her father had done to me, and she didn't expect me to respond, but she wanted to shoot her shot anyway. I was skeptical at first. Was this some kind of trap, some weird attempt by Richard to get back at me? But I agreed to meet her for coffee. Sarah was nothing like her father. She was humble, hard-working, honest. She told me that watching her father's fall had been devastating, but it had also taught her what not to do. She said I saw how he treated people, how he lied and manipulated, how he thought loyalty was something people owed him, but he didn't owe them. I don't want to be like that. I want to build things the right way. I hired her, and she's been one of my best employees ever since. She works hard, she's innovative, she cares about our clients, and every time I see her, I think about the irony. Richard tried to replace me with some kid half my age who didn't know what he was doing, and now I'm mentoring his own daughter, teaching her how to build a business the right way. Sometimes karma has a sense of humor. I asked Sarah once if her father knew she worked for me. She said he did. I asked how he felt about it. She said, he doesn't talk about it. I think it embarrasses him. But honestly, I don't care what he thinks anymore. He made his choices. I'm making mine. Another thing that happened in these 5 years is I reconnected with some of the people who lost their jobs when Meridian collapsed. A few of them reached out after the trial, thanking me for testifying. We started getting coffee occasionally, catching up, and I realized that a lot of them were struggling. Not because they weren't talented, but because the industry had changed while they were at Meridian and they didn't have the updated skills or connections to compete. So I started a program through Apex. We bring in mid-career professionals who've been displaced from their jobs. We train them on modern supply chain technologies, introduce them to our network, and help them find new positions. Sometimes we hire them ourselves. So far we've helped over 30 people get back on their feet. One of them said to me, "You didn't just destroy Richard's company, you're building something better from the ashes." I never thought of it that way, but I guess it's true. Richard built Meridian on exploitation, taking credit for other people's work, squeezing value out of employees without giving back. When that model collapsed, it left a lot of people hurt. I'm trying to build something different, something sustainable, something where people are valued, where loyalty goes both ways, where success is shared, not hoarded. And you know what? It's working. We're growing faster than Meridian ever did, and we're doing it without lying, without cutting corners, without treating people like disposable assets. Turns out, you can be successful and ethical at the same time. Who knew? I also started speaking at industry conferences, telling my story. Not the revenge part, obviously. I'm not stupid, but I talk about loyalty, about the importance of valuing your employees, about how short-term thinking leads to long-term disaster. I've had dozens of executives come up to me after these talks. Some of them thank me for the reminder. Others get defensive, saying, "Business is competitive. Sometimes you have to make hard choices." And I always say the same thing. You're right. Business is competitive. But your biggest competitive advantage isn't your technology or your pricing. It's your people. And if you treat them like they're replaceable, you'll find out real quick that you're the one who's replaceable. Last year, I got invited to speak at a major logistics summit. Guess who else was speaking? Richard. He'd somehow managed to rebuild a tiny sliver of credibility and was talking about lessons learned from business failure. I almost declined the invitation when I found out. But then I thought, why should I hide? I didn't do anything wrong, so I went. Richard's talk was before mine. I sat in the audience and listened. He talked about how he'd made mistakes, how he'd trusted the wrong people, how he'd expanded too fast, how he'd over-leveraged the company financially. He didn't mention firing me. He didn't mention lying to investors. He didn't mention any of the actual reasons Meridian failed. He blamed external market forces, bad timing, bad luck. It was bullshit. And everyone in that room knew it. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't call him out directly, but I told my story. I talked about spending 25 years building a company. I talked about being fired at 59 because I was too expensive. I talked about how that company collapsed within a year because it was built on relationships and expertise that walked out the door with me. I talked about the importance of investing in your people because your people are your company. The applause at the end was thunderous. People stood up. Afterwards, a line of executives waited to talk to me, shake my hand, exchange business cards. Richard was in the back of the room. He left before I finished. A colleague told me later that Richard had been hoping to network at the conference, hoping to find investors or partners for some new venture he was trying to start. But after my talk, after everyone in the industry was reminded of what he'd done, no one wanted to touch him. He left the conference with nothing. Good. About 6 months ago, something surreal happened. I got an email from Richard. Subject line, "I owe you an apology." I stared at it for a long time before opening it. Part of me wanted to delete it, but curiosity won. The email was long, pages long. He wrote about how he'd spent the last 5 years in therapy, trying to understand why he'd made the choices he made, how he'd been driven by ego and greed, how he'd convinced himself that he was the reason for Meridian's success, not me, how he'd seen me as a threat to his authority and status, and firing me was his way of asserting control. He wrote about how losing everything, the company, the money, his family, his freedom, had forced him to confront who he really was, and he didn't like what he saw. He said he'd spent time in prison, reading, reflecting, trying to figure out how to be a better person. He said he knew an apology couldn't undo the damage he'd caused, but he wanted me to know that he was sorry, genuinely, deeply sorry. He wrote, "You deserved better. After 25 years of loyalty, you deserved to retire with dignity and respect. Instead, I betrayed you. I threw you away, and I've spent every day since paying for that decision. I don't expect your forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I understand what I did was wrong." I read the email 3 times. I sat with it for days. Part of me wanted to write back something scathing, to remind him of every way he'd hurt me, every lie he'd told, every person he'd screwed over. But then I realized something. I didn't need to. Richard had already lost everything. His company, his money, his family, his reputation, his freedom. He was living in a tiny apartment, working a job he hated, knowing that everyone in the industry remembered what he'd done. He was already living in hell. What more could I possibly say? So I wrote back 1 sentence. "I accept your apology. I hope you've learned from this." I didn't say I forgave him, because I haven't. I probably never will. But I accepted his apology, because holding on to anger was exhausting, and I didn't want to give him any more of my energy. My wife asked me if I felt closure after that email. I thought about it. I said I don't need closure. I needed justice, and I got it. Richard's apology doesn't change anything. It doesn't give me back the time I lost. It doesn't undo the stress and pain he caused. But it does confirm what I already knew. I was right. He was wrong, and he knows it. That was enough for me. These days, I don't think about Richard much. I'm too busy living my life. Last month, my wife and I celebrated our 35th wedding anniversary. We took a cruise through the Mediterranean, stopped in Greece, Italy, Croatia. It was incredible. We talked about how different our lives would be if I'd still been at Meridian. I'd probably still be working 60-hour weeks, stressed, exhausted, waiting for retirement. Instead, I'm semi-retired at 64. I work when I want. I take time off when I want. I spend time with my grandkids. I travel. I'm happy. My wife said, "Do you ever regret what you did, taking down Meridian?" I said, "Not even a little. Richard took 25 years of my life. I took back my power. That's not revenge. That's justice." She smiled. "I'm proud of you. You didn't let him win." And that's the thing. A lot of people think revenge is about making the other person suffer. And sure, Richard suffered. But that wasn't the point. The point was taking back control of my life, proving to myself that I had value beyond what Richard told me I had, building something better than what I'd lost, showing the world that experience and expertise matter, that you can't just replace people and expect everything to be fine. I won because I'm thriving. I won because I built something from nothing. Again, I won because I'm happy, respected, and successful. Richard lost because he learned, too late, that success built on taking credit for other people's work is fragile, that loyalty can't be demanded, it has to be earned, that people are not disposable. I hope other business owners read this story. I hope they think twice before firing someone who's been loyal to them. I hope they realize that short-term profits aren't worth long-term destruction. I hope they understand that the person they're screwing over might be the only thing holding their company together. And if they don't learn that lesson from my story, they'll learn it the hard way, just like Richard did. As for me, I'm done looking back. I'm focused on the future. Apex is growing. We're opening a new office next year. We're hiring more people. We're making a difference in people's lives. And that feels better than any revenge ever could. Because at the end of the day, the best revenge isn't destroying someone else. It's building something so successful that you don't have time to think about them anymore. I destroyed Richard's company, but more importantly, I built my own. And that's the real victory. So if you're reading this and you've been betrayed by someone you trusted, someone you gave years of your life to, someone who threw you away like you meant nothing, hear me. You are not powerless. You are not disposable. You have value, and you have choices. You can take that betrayal and let it destroy you, or you can take it and use it as fuel to build something better, fuel to prove them wrong, fuel to show the world what you're capable of. I chose the second option, and it changed my life. 5 years ago, I was a fired 59-year-old man who thought his career was over. Today, I'm a successful business owner, a mentor, a speaker, and a grandfather who gets to spend time with his family. I won, Richard lost, and that's exactly how it should be.